Paul George from Fresno State, 6'9", 214 pounds, almost 17 points, 7 rebounds.
Amazing opportunity. I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to play.
Paul George once represented everything fans hoped for in the new generation of NBA stars. A dynamic two-way player capable of spectacular scoring explosions and lockdown defense.
Smith with a block from behind, but George gets it back and jams it.
Yet recent seasons, marked by inconsistent play, frequent absences, and surprising comments about feeling bored, have recast him as a symbol of the modern NBA's deeper issues. But are we watching the disintegration of nightly competitiveness through his casual approach? But before we get to it, make sure to check out our Hoop Hype store, stocked with hoodies, tees, and mugs that represent your love for basketball. Check the link in the description or tap View Products to support our channel. Paul George was never projected to be a superstar when he first entered the NBA in 2010 as the 10th overall pick by the Indiana Pacers.
10th pick in the 2010 NBA draft, the Indiana Pacers select Paul George of Fresno State.
But his rapid rise to prominence shocked everyone. Initially a lanky, athletic forward, George quickly separated himself from other mid-lottery picks by showcasing unstoppable defensive prowess and emerging offensive versatility. Under head coach Frank Vogel, he found early success as a key defensive stopper against LeBron James's Miami Heat, a sign that George could eventually ascend to a top-tier player. A turning point occurred during the 2013 playoffs when George matched up with LeBron in the Eastern Conference Finals. Though the Pacers lost in 7 games, George's leadership, clutch shot making, and resilience catapulted him into stardom. That breakthrough overshadowed concerns about his raw offensive skill. By the next season, he averaged around 22 points per game and garnered legitimate MVP buzz, flashing a knack for jaw-dropping slam dunks, step-back threes, and tight, relentless on-ball defense. Many heralded him as the new face of the Pacers, predicting he'd anchor the franchise for a decade. When George suffered a catastrophic leg injury during a Team USA scrimmage in the summer of 2014, fans rallied behind his comeback story. The narrative became one of grit and perseverance. George working tirelessly in rehab, determined to reclaim his all-star form, and reclaim it he did, returning stronger than anticipated. By 2016, he seemed poised to command an enduring place among the league's elite wings. In those days, George embodied the future of the NBA, physically gifted, committed to both ends of the floor, and brimming with star potential. He was often compared to legends like Scottie Pippen for his defensive range and offensive growth. Hoops enthusiasts praised his tenacity, composure, and willingness to challenge juggernauts like LeBron's Heat or the budding Cleveland Cavaliers. All of which made his subsequent transformations and revelations feel even more disheartening. If once we saw him as a humble, unrelenting competitor, now many wonder whether that version was a facade overshadowed by load management, questionable comments, and a tendency to mail in certain stretches of the season. How did Paul George go from a near MVP candidate to an emblem of the NBA's perceived malaise? The seeds of disillusionment with Paul George were planted when fans observed his increasingly erratic engagement on the court. Although he still delivered occasional masterclasses, racking up 30-plus points in statement games or locking down top scorers, such performances began to feel like special occasion events rather than a nightly expectation. As injuries mounted, so did the sense that George was no longer giving maximum effort from October to April. Yet the biggest blow came not from his stat line, but from his own words. George started a personal podcast, providing him with a direct channel to fans. Instead of typical star bravado or behind-the-scenes positivity, he offered startling admissions about feeling bored by midseason obligations like the All-Star Game. Instead of championing the thrill of facing other elites, he joked about how this event cut into players' downtime and forced them to exert energy they'd rather conserve. For many fans, that was a bitter pill to swallow. An All-Star casually admitting that the weekend extravaganza, once revered for generating iconic moments, meant little. If a star can't muster excitement for a marquee event, what does that say about his day-to-day approach? The matter magnified a broader league-wide complaint. Some players, especially those with star status, treat large chunks of the season as warm-ups for the playoffs. They appear to pick their spots, missing games for rest, or giving half-speed efforts to preserve themselves. George, in referencing how tough it was to go hard for even one All-Star showcase, inadvertently highlighted the apathy critics see in the modern NBA. Fans remember a time when luminaries such as Kobe Bryant or Michael Jordan used the All-Star stage to duel fellow greats, not to coast and grin for cameras. Furthermore, George's disinterest isn't limited to exhibitions. Post-game press conferences occasionally show a star who's unafraid to say he's taking nights off or is unmotivated against lesser teams. That attitude fosters cynicism about whether regular season matchups matter to top-tier players. When an influential talent like Paul George shrugs off obligations, it seemingly validates that skipping critical games or coasting through them is acceptable. This boredom and complacency is precisely what older generations, both players and fans, lament when diagnosing the league's perceived softness. One reason Paul George's confession stings so sharply is that he's hardly ever on the floor to start with, at least relative to the near Iron Man standards of past eras. While injuries can legitimately sideline a player, fans roll their eyes when the label soreness alone can prompt a star to miss extended time. George's repeated stints on the injury report, whether in Oklahoma City with the Los Angeles Clippers or his current circumstances, accentuate a league trend, so-called load management. The premise behind load management is to maintain star availability for the playoffs by reducing mileage in the regular season. On paper, it sounds logical. Yet in practice, fans end up seeing full-price tickets for marquee games minus the presence of their favorite all-stars. For local supporters who only attend 1 or 2 matches yearly, learning that George decided to rest can ruin the entire experience. They realize they might have been better off staying home, especially if the outcome becomes lopsided or lacking in star power. Comparisons to older generations abound. Rewind 2 decades. Players like Allen Iverson, Kevin Garnett, or John Stockton braved entire seasons with minimal rest days. Injuries were endured, not systematically planned for. If a star had enough strength to suit up, he gave it a go. Today, we might see announcements of George skipping an away game to preserve health. Even though the team is trailing in the standings or facing a formidable opponent, fans are eager to watch him match up against. This phenomenon chips away at the concept of genuine competition. It fosters the notion that stars care only about their brand and playoff stats, content to let the regular season serve as a glorified practice schedule. Combined with George's flippant remarks about all-star duties, it amplifies a sense that the NBA's 82-game marathon is devalued in the eyes of its participants. If star players only exert top effort in April or May, how can fans be expected to treat midseason showdowns as must-see TV? George's repeated absences thus add another bullet point to why critics label the modern NBA as soft or uninspiring. Paul George's self-anointed nickname, Playoff P, quickly turned into an internet meme. The moniker implied a certain inevitability that come the postseason, George would transform into a decisive, unstoppable force. And to be fair, he has put together formidable playoff performances, especially in Indiana and occasionally in Oklahoma City. But ironically, it's the letdowns that overshadow these bright spots. Instances of sub-20% shooting nights, poor decisions in the clutch, or failure to propel heavily favored squads past earlier playoff rounds tarnish the brand. Look at George's time with the Clippers, for example. Built to be a championship contender with Kawhi Leonard, that team stumbled in the bubble after losing a 3-1 lead to the Denver Nuggets. George's inconsistent shooting and infamous side of the backboard brick in critical moments fueled the narrative of fake hustle or empty hype. While no single meltdown entirely rests on George, the star power he claims typically demands accountability. Fans dub it the PG cycle. He might break out with a 35-point game in round 1, then follow it with a 4-for-17 outing that dooms his team in round 2. Pundits ironically ask, where is the unstoppable scorer who leaps from half-court sets to posterized defenders? Why does that version appear in waves, never sustaining the brilliance for a full series or a complete playoff run? To some, these roller coaster postseasons reaffirm broader league anxieties. Top-tier players coast or vanish at times, intensifying only when they choose. If the league's marquee names truly cared about proving themselves, how could such shocking flameouts happen so frequently? It's not that modern talents lack skill, it's that their engagement seems situational. In an era where many NBA stars have personal platforms, YouTube channels, social media diaries, or personal podcasts, Paul George's show stands out for the level of candor it provides. Far from standard PR talk, he often shares behind-the-scenes glimpses of how he truly feels about the regular season, all-star obligations, or even postseason intensity. Yet, to some fans, these revelations confirm the worst suspicions, that many stars don't relish the 82-game grind, and that some events they're supposed to value come off as mere chores. Consider George's open admission that players view All-Star Weekend not as a celebration, but as a burden that interrupts an otherwise restful break. Coming from a multi-time All-Star, such remarks sound especially jarring, giving weight to critics who say the event itself has lost luster precisely because big names go half speed and treat it like a forced appearance. When an event is overshadowed by the star's disinterest, is it a surprise that TV ratings continue to sag? Similarly, George's self-mockery or joking around the concept of having to exert energy in mid-season reveals an underlying complacency. Typically, fans imagine an ultra-competitive star who bristles at the idea of losing in any format, be it All-Star, preseason, or scrimmages. Some legends, Kobe Bryant for instance, set a tone that every game was a chance to sharpen skills and showcase pride. But hearing George's comedic shrug intensifies the perception of a new generation that sees parts of the NBA schedule as obstacles to personal rest. Another strand in these podcast episodes is how seldom George talks about forging deep rivalries or chasing regular season feats. Instead, it might revolve around personal brand building or post-basketball interests. While it's laudable for athletes to expand their horizons, fans notice the shift away from a die-hard focus on wins. Nostalgic watchers recall when superstars centered entire lifestyles around dominating from tip-off to the final buzzer, 12 months a year. Every player eventually grapples with how they'll be remembered. For Paul George, the question is whether his final narrative will highlight the jaw-dropping nights, like 40-point bursts or lockdown defense on prime LeBron James, or if fans will forever associate him with half-hearted comments about boredom and sporadic postseason letdowns. In a talent-rich league, if you're dubbed an all-star or a franchise cornerstone, fans and analysts measure you against the best of your era. In the past, George's two-way ability placed him in discussions next to Kawhi Leonard, Jimmy Butler, and other superstars. But his repeated absences, load-managed cameo appearances, and self-sabotaging playoff performances have undercut that tier status. While he's still recognized as a top 20 or top 30 player, that's a far cry from the top 5 chatter he once flirted with. Additionally, the notion that his generation of stars might revolve more around brand building than every game competitiveness tarnishes how future fans might interpret their resumes. If Hall of Famers from the 1990s or 2000s rarely took nights off, historians might question how to rank someone like George, who openly admits to coasting through midseason. The NBA's structure, amplifying star marketing, gives these players the benefit of massive salaries and global followings, but that can boomerang if the public grows disillusioned by their perceived indifference. Should the Clippers, or whichever team George calls home, fail to secure a championship, that mixed bag legacy cements itself. If, on the other hand, George experiences a late career renaissance, staying healthy, logging 70-plus games, thriving deep into the playoffs, he could rectify much of the current narrative. Fans are quick to forgive if a star embraces redemption, as we've seen with others who overcame rough mid-prime years to finish strong. Paul George's stance doesn't exist in a vacuum. It intersects with every hot-button complaint about the modern NBA. As George references how mid-season obligations hamper rest, fans link that to the epidemic of marquee players skipping marquee games. The league's attempt to penalize rest days or discourage mass absences stumbles if a star of George's stature nonchalantly admits that players prefer to avoid playing. The All-Star Game used to be a showstopper, a highlight of the basketball calendar. George casually remarking on how players see it as an annoying break from vacation speaks volumes. It's no surprise that All-Star Sunday often devolves into a half-speed exhibition with final scores resembling rec league tallies. Many argue that the beauty of, say, the NFL is that every game features maximum intensity because each star suits up for most of the limited 17-game season. By contrast, the NBA's 82-game slate sees top players sometimes playing only 60, plus inattentive efforts in certain matchups. George epitomizes that pattern. Folks say that big names only flip the switch in late April. George's own stories about saving energy for when it counts or feeling bored in January feed that exact narrative. The result, the league invests in marketing a 6-month regular season that star players treat as the dress rehearsal. So for critics, George is the perfect scapegoat to label the modern NBA as soft or uninteresting. Whether that scapegoating is fully fair or not, the synergy of load management, half-hearted All-Star Weekend remarks, and so-so playoff payoffs cement the argument. Meanwhile, fans longing for the daily drama of old-school rivalries see George's brand of complacency as further reason to watch only big playoff series, or maybe to switch their attention to other sports altogether. Paul George remains a premier talent, yet his public declarations of boredom and sporadic devotion stress why many fans cry foul about today's NBA. Once celebrated for playoff heroics and strong leadership, he now seems emblematic of load management, half-speed all-star appearances, and a shallower competitive zeal. Whether this is purely Paul George's failing or a league-wide transformation doesn't matter much to fans left disappointed by star absences and lukewarm effort until the postseason. In the end, George's approach emphasizes a broader concern that the NBA's daily product has drifted from its once intense core. But let us know your thoughts below, and don't forget to support the channel by purchasing some gear from our store. We'll see you in our next video shown on screen.